I thought, let me sort of set a few things straight before we proceed today. Though my slide says cognitive behavior therapy, we are really looking at an overview of cognitive behavior therapy, because cognitive behavior therapy is not something that one can learn over a 1 hour or 2 hour or even a 10-hour lecture. Sure, you can read up all the books that are there, all, the journals, magazines, anything that is available, but only when you put it in practice and under supervision over several hours can one hope to become an expert in the field of cognitive behavior therapy. So, when the set of questions that parents were interested in, and over today's talk, many of them had said that they wanted a certificate, they wanted to understand and learn how to carry out cognitive behavior therapy. Unfortunately, that may not be possible today, because this is something which is a super specialized area, which requires years of training and practice. However, many a times there are children and maybe even adults who may require cognitive behavior therapy. And therefore, in my mind, and I think also in the organizer's mind, the aim of today's presentation is to get an overview, to get an idea of what is cognitive behavior therapy and who would benefit from cognitive behavior therapy. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I saw a lot of parents wanting to know how academic functioning of their children can be improved, how their children's cognitive abilities can be improved, how children can, be better at studying, at reading, at school related issues. Today's talk may not help you in that. However, there were other questions related to how can I make my child less resistant, more compliant, anger management. Maybe some of those issues can be, the tips that I give you can help you tackle some of those issues today. Right? Having set the stage right, let's go straight away into the talk. I'm going to start off by talking to you about a child who was very recently referred, and with whom I did cognitive behavior therapy. We were successful in trying to help him elevate all of his symptoms. I'm not saying he was 100% cured. It is a process, because, once the issues come, then we have to keep monitoring to make sure that these issues don't come, repeatedly. But in a short span of maybe 2 months, we were able to bring about 80% recovery in this child. And that's the beauty of this whole cognitive behavior therapy. So I'll start off with that, then put cognitive behavior therapy in a historical perspective. From there, then I will talk to you about how, what are some of the main components of a cognitive behavior therapy, and then how we go about doing it. We'll come back to this case, and I will talk to you about how I handle some of the cognitive issues in this child. And then, I'll talk about another child that I'm seeing currently. And then we will throw it open for question and answer sessions. I'm sure a lot of you would have a lot of questions already. We'll give you enough time to talk to us about it. And anytime you want to get in touch with me, I'm sure you can get in touch with me through the organizers. Right? So with that, let's start for the day. I'm going to be talking about this child. I've deliberately removed names because I want to protect the confidentiality of the child. And this is something that I'm sure all of you understand and would appreciate, that we do not share identifying details with anybody. Right? So we'll call him AD. AD, currently is 9 years old. He's an only child. He lives with his parents, although he has extended family in Bangalore, in Chennai, and Hyderabad. But they all, the parents and the family are based in Bangalore. He is a high achiever. In school, he has always been coming first or second. And, off late, though, his position has come down a little. He has been, he has dropped to 5. But he has always fluctuated between first and second rank. He is a perfectionist, would like to do everything perfectly. If it's not perfect, even if his parents ask him to let go, he is not happy about it, and he wants to submit only work that is perfect. His aim, when I asked him what is it that you want to do, he said, I want to come first in class. That is his aim currently. He plays badminton, so it's not only studies. And even in badminton, he wants to win all the time. He has been playing badminton for a while now, maybe 3 years. And every time he loses a game, maybe a good game, maybe a bad game, maybe he goes up to semifinals, but he gets very upset if he does not win a game. And this child is, very dependent on his mother. He wants his mother to be around him all the time. He can do his homework, he can study, he can do a lot of the activities on his own, but he prefers that his mother is around with him every single step of the day, barring the little time that he is in school. A little bit about the parents, because oftentimes we do find that sometimes there can be maintaining factors in the family itself. Parents themselves are high achievers. Both of them are engineers, although the mother currently is a homemaker. But both come from family of engineers and people with PhDs. They may not necessarily be medical doctors, but people with PhDs, and so very high achieving family, both of them. Mother is fairly strict, and I think this is the same story in most homes. Mother is strict, she insists on things being done in a particular way. Father is a little bit more relaxed, but he's very proud of the fact that his wife gets things done, and he is also very proud that both his wife and his son are very organized and they have things done in a particular way. So there are no really issues as such within the family. Both parents don't exert any amount of pressure on the child to come first. Father understands that it's okay, sometimes you're 10th, sometimes you're 25th. It really doesn't matter. Mother may not be very happy about the child slipping very far away from maybe the first 10 ranks, but they don't put any pressure on the child to either excel in academics or in sports. However, the subliminal messages that they do give the child is that they are very proud of him, that every time he achieves this. All of them believe in God, they're very religious, and they place a lot of emphasis on religion and cultural practices. Again, this is not something that is wrong, this is not something that should not be done, but just to give you an understanding of where this family comes from. It's a nuclear family, a traditional family, a family that has a very strong set of moral values, a close knit family. They're very close to their extended family, so there's a lot of visiting happening. In fact, the child was referred to me by his uncle, not by the parents initially, or not from a school or anybody else. The uncle took the initiative and said, I think there's something happening, and if you could please see this child. So, a beautiful, well knit family. Why was the child referred? Now, the parents noticed that about 2 years ago this started, and this child was a bit anxious. They noticed that his dependence on the mother increased. He would be very upset if the mother had to go shopping or leave him alone with the father, or if the father had to take over doing his homework, and because the mother was ill or she was busy. The parents have never traveled away without the child. They've always been with him. But they noticed that he was beginning to get very anxious. He would frequently ask his mother questions like, Amma, if I do something wrong, will God punish me? Am I being a good child? Do you think I'm good? These sort of questions, and constantly with the mother, to a point where the mother got exhausted giving him the answer to this same question. So the question would be asked somewhere. It started with 1 or 2 questions a day, and then went up to a point where he would ask this question about 20 or 30 times in a day. In addition to this, he also always worried that he was swearing, he was using foul language. The parents had never heard him use bad words, and the bad words were not really very flowery language, words like stupid or idiot. But he felt that he was using these words, and if he uses these words, what if his friends hear him? What if God hears him? Will he then be punished? And that constant preoccupation was what led him to be anxious, and that was what he would that was why he would keep asking his mother for reassurance. Am I a good boy? Is it okay? Will God punish me? Because of this, he would not want to step out of the house without the vibhuti on his forehead. Remember, I said all the three of them are very religious. So this was okay with them because it was a practice that every day after you have your bath, you go down, pray to God, apply vibhuti on your forehead, and that's how your day starts. This was a routine that all of them followed. But for this boy, that if for some reason the vibhuti was not applied on his head, that would then cause him to have a meltdown. So gradually, from being anxious, he started demanding that the vibhuti had to be there on his forehead. If it went away, he would go back running into the god's room to apply the vibhuti and then come back out. He would never leave the house without the vibhuti on his forehead. So parents found that a bit odd, but they let it be. In the last 2 months, just before he was brought to me, he was noticed to perform certain acts repetitively, and he called it KK for want of a better word. I'm not sure what KK means, but I'm sure it means something in his language. What really he would do is if somebody dropped a book or kicked a school bag or a piece of paper on the floor or a pencil or an eraser, then immediately he had to take his hands to his eyes, like we would do if we touch somebody with our legs, right? So which is okay, we all do it. If I kick somebody by mistake, I would say sorry, and then I would do something to touch my eyes or my cheek or whatever it is. This is something that is a very traditional thing. I think it's a South Indian thing. I'm not sure if it's there in North India, but it's a very common thing that a lot of people do, because we are told that you should not touch anything to do with books or paper with our legs, and that is Ma Saraswati, and we have to treat it with respect. So, again, there's nothing wrong about this. But here's what happened with this child. The parents noticed that if a book or something fell on the floor by mistake, the child was noticed to do this act 8 times or 10 times. It reached a point where every half an hour he was doing this. He would probably spend a lot of time in the bathroom doing this, in his bedroom doing this. Before going to bed, he was noticed to do this. As soon as he woke up, he was noticed to do this. So it was throughout the day he was preoccupied. If he lost a game in badminton, he felt it was because he was a bad child, and that's why God is punishing him by making him lose. If he wrote a question in school, he felt that he deliberately had not written the complete answer. But that was not true, because if that was the case, then he cannot have fifth rank in class. His answers were almost near perfect, but he always worried that maybe I've written an answer that is not correct. And so he stopped giving, we all have a habit of asking our child, so how did you do in your test today, or how did the exam go? And his answer started becoming, I don't know, I'm not sure, because he felt that he was not confident about whether he had written the answer at all or not. Or he had this thought in his mind that he deliberately would have written the wrong answer. So you can see that there's a series of events which have happened to indicate to the parents that he's very anxious and worried about something. That then they spoke to the father's brother about. Father's brother knew me personally, and so he took the initiative to refer the family to us. So this is what we have. So these are the kind of children that we often would want to enroll into a cognitive behavior therapy process. So that brings us to the question then, what is cognitive behavior therapy? I will come back to this child and I will show you how cognitive behavior therapy was used, what are the techniques that we have used with this child. I'll talk to you about all of that. Cognitive behavior therapy is a therapeutic process, which means it's like a treatment, right? Like if I have fever, I have to take a paracetamol, I have to take Dolo, I have to take Crocin. This is like therapy for several symptoms that should be delivered by a trained clinical psychologist and should be done in a therapeutic setting. We call them clients, we don't call them patients. Unlike certain other forms of therapies, in CBT, whoever is referred, it could be a child, it could be an adult. Primarily, you must remember, cognitive behavior therapy was started for adults, and then there were certain modifications which were made to allow this to be effective for children as well, right? Now, how does this work? The therapeutic process involves the understanding of the client's thoughts and helping the client to understand, to identify, and to change negative or dysfunctional thoughts, ideas, and beliefs. So, the core of cognitive behavior therapy is that our feelings are related to our thoughts. And if these thoughts are positive, we would feel positive, we would feel happy, we would feel energetic. If, however, the thoughts are negative, they result in us feeling bad, they result in us feeling anxious, they result in us feeling angry. So the whole atmosphere is negative. So the thoughts underlie the feelings that we experience. This then sets the tone for how we're going to interpret the events around us. That leads to beliefs. Beliefs then become stable over a period of time, and that then dictates our thoughts. So it's a cycle, and this has an impact on the individual's behavior. This is the core of CBT. And this form of therapy, you must, just to give you a little bit of history into how cognitive behavior therapy came about, it's a branch of behavioral psychology. So you had the Freudian psychoanalytic psychotherapies, where the therapist would play a very minimal role. So the typical, sitting on the couch, the therapist sitting on a sofa, and the patient lying on the couch. What you see in movies, what you probably they were attempting to depict in Dear Zindagi. Those of you who've seen that movie, Shah Rukh Khan was the therapist, and I think Alia Bhatt was his client. They started off by showing that, and of course, it became confused along the way. But still, the ambience that they were trying to set was that of psychoanalysis, where you need the couch and you need the chair behind the couch. It's very deliberately placed. The lighting of the room is done very deliberate. It's a dark room. The client lies down with the eyes closed and begins talking. All the therapist does is, indicate that he or she is listening, but they don't interfere with the flow of the speech of the client. Even after the client has finished speaking for a whole hour, all they do is, thank you for sharing, and then let's meet again next week. So the psychoanalytic form of therapy does not allow the therapist to take an active role in the therapeutic process. Aaron Beck, who's considered to be the father of cognitive behavior therapy, is a behaviorist, and behaviorist schools felt that this is not how we would understand behavior or dysfunctional behavior, and we would like to take a more active role. And that's how the behavioral school came into being, saying that if an individual is displaying a particular behavior, that behavior has to be a learned behavior. If it's learned, then we can help them unlearn it. And in order to unlearn, the therapist's responsibility is to identify which are these behaviors, what is promoting that learning, and how can we bring about a disconnect. So it's a more active, a lot more involvement from the therapist. And Aaron Beck used, so it was only behavioral at that point. So, the ABA therapies that some of you may want to use for your children comes from the behavioral school of therapy, and probably you can see some semblance or resemblance to that in the cognitive behavior therapy. So behavioral school brought about behavior therapy, where they focused only on behavior. Aaron Beck said, I'm going a step further and saying it's not just behavior, but your thoughts and your emotions dictate terms, and that's how your behavior comes about. So he sort of brought about cognitive behavior therapy. So the term cognitive and behavior stems from these two cornerstones or pillars of the therapy. That is, thoughts and ideas are cognitive processes which result in the way we feel and interpret the environment, and that brings about a certain behavior in us. If we identify the cause for the behavior, it would invariably be a thought, and if this thought is addressed, then there will be an implication in the sense that the behavior will be changed. So that's the whole premise of the therapy. Now, like I said, unlike psychoanalysis, which is the predecessor for cognitive behavior therapy, this therapy is not carried out for a long duration of time. Psychoanalysis, like I told you earlier, the Freudian psychoanalysis, can be carried on for years, maybe 10 years, 14 years. The clients are in therapy for very, very, very long periods of time. However, cognitive behavior therapy is for a very short duration. You can see anywhere from 4 weeks to about 30 weeks is maximum. And at the end of that, the symptoms, like I said, can reduce quite drastically. Both the therapist and the clients are actively involved in the therapy, and they identify issues and they work on it. Uh, at no point in time will the therapist give you advice in terms of do this and don't do this. So a lot of times parents come and tell me, I'm a counselor. I advise people, but I can't advise my child. Unfortunately, they believe that giving advice is the same as counseling, and counseling is the same as therapy. However, the three are quite different. Advice means like what a lawyer would do. Do this, don't do this. If you do this, this will be the outcome. If you don't do this, then this is what will be the impact. That is advice, right? Counseling is to look at problems which are minor, which have an easy fix, and which are, maybe for simple day to day issues. However, therapy is a much, much deeper issue, and at no point in time will a therapist tell you what to do. The therapist will work with the client to identify the issues. They will help by placing all the facts on the table. And then the client will then be encouraged to explore for from within himself or herself or through the environment to see what options are available, try it out, and then see if that works or not. Which means that the therapist and the client together will set up like a behavioral experiment to see if this works. And if it does, then they come back and report it. And if it doesn't, then they set up another experiment. So that is how both behavior therapy and cognitive therapy works. And in this way, it's not that the therapist cannot tell you, this is what you should do. But if they did, then the client's dependence on the therapist increases several times, which is not what we want to do. We want to empower the client, not to become a crutch for them, right? So we want to empower them with strategies to look at identifying the problems and to create positive solutions for these problems. And that's how CBT works. What are some of the mental health conditions for which we can use CBT? You can see that there is addiction, negative thoughts and emotions, as in depression and anxiety, anger management, when there is death, when there is grief, when there's loss, when there's chronic pain, like say somebody has arthritis. How do you help them cope with that, right? You can't cure the arthritis, but there is pain, and it's a genuine pain. How do you get the individual to cope with this? Overcoming trauma to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's what PTSD stands for sleep disorders. Primarily, however, CBT is best suited for anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, all of which have negative thoughts and emotions, right? In addition to that, you can also have certain behavioral excesses, maybe restlessness, distractibility, not complying to rules, which is what we see with children. And we can help them address some of these issues as well using cognitive behavior therapy. Like I said, the core of the mechanism of cognitive behavior therapy is the cognitive distortions. They are called cognitive distortions. Cognition refers to mental processes like thinking, reasoning, problem solving, attention, memory, etc. So there are distortions in the way we think. These distortions then influence our behaviors through our emotions. So it's like a cogwheel, right? So when one gear or cog is set in motion, it sets off the motions of the other gears, and then they're all intertwined, and this goes on and on and on in a loop. I feel I'm fat. That may be a distortion. And because I'm fat, nobody loves me, right? So that's my distortion. Because nobody loves me, I'm frustrated and angry. That's my emotion. Because I'm angry, I'm always fighting with people and I'm driving them away. Because I'm driving them away, they don't want to be friends with me. Because they're not friends with me, I believe nobody loves me. I believe nobody loves me because I'm fat. And then this whole cycle goes on again and again and again. And that is how cognitive distortions are born. There may be something, that sort of brought this forward, but then there are a lot of things in the environment that maintains this problem, and that is your cognitive distortion which maintains this. Once it's maintained, your negative emotions are maintained, which then leads to problem behavior, and the cycle goes on and on. So CBT works on tackling the core issue, which is your cognitive distortion. What do I mean by a cognitive distortion? I've been talking about this from the beginning. There's so many of them, and there are many more cognitive distortions, but I'm just presenting a few of them to give you an idea, and I'm sure we all are guilty of several of these, and I'm going to give you a lot of examples for this. Filtering. Okay. Most of us know that our brain is wired in such a way that we remember the negative impacts or negative emotions much more than the positive emotions. So, why does a person remain depressed even though he or she might have had a good day? Like, often I ask my clients, "How have you been?" And they'll say, "Oh, I'm not good, doctor." Why? Because last night my child did not let me sleep, or I fought with my husband yesterday. But I met you, last Thursday, and from last Thursday to this Thursday, you've had one fight with your husband, and then you're saying you're not good. How have the other days been? Last night you fought, which was Wednesday. What happened to Tuesday? What happened to Monday? What happened to the weekend? And then that will set them thinking, oh yeah, actually my husband took me out, we went shopping. This is before the pre-COVID days, of course. We went out and we had a good time. I had lunch, and then I came back. I was a little tired, but otherwise I had a good day. So I said, how come you're not remembering that? And that's how filtering works, that usually we tend to remember the negative things and blow that out of proportion, and that is so strong that it negates all the other positive emotions or experiences that we may have had. Black and white thinking, and I struggle with this black and white thinking constantly with people, right? Just 2 days ago I was giving a talk to another group of people on parenting, and one of the things that I said was, that do's and don'ts, you have to be really firm about some of the do's and don'ts with your children. And so immediately the question was, is it okay for us to punish our children? I said, punishment is not okay. So then another parent said, then if you're saying no punishment, then should I never correct my child? There, right there, is an example of black and white thinking. Is there nothing in between no correction at all and punishment? Can we not have something in between? But invariably, one of the most common cognitive distortions is this black and white thinking. Either I should be angry or I should be happy. There is nothing in between, right? Then, overgeneralization. One day you make a mistake and people laugh at you, then you believe that every single day you're going to be laughed at, or you're going to make a fool of yourself. Or just because this one person in the office doesn't like me, nobody in the world does not like me. So overgeneralization of things or experiences or events. Catastrophization, right? That, oh my God, I tripped and fell right in front of my client. I made an ass of myself. That means I've lost this client for good and I'm never going to be able to do anything, right? In children, most often, just before an exam, when something goes wrong, they get so frustrated, they blame everything on that one thing. The tip of the pencil broke just before an exam, and that is enough to let them mess up the whole exam, right? Because deals with these kind of thoughts that this one event went wrong, that is a sign, it's a signal that it's going to be a horrible thing for me, I'm going to lose, I'm going to fail, I'm going to die, etc. Personalization, that everything is about me. That day my mother yelled at me even though I did not do any wrong, but your mother may have yelled at you because she was in a bad mood, and the bad mood could be because appa and amma had a fight. But the child is not able to de-link himself from everything that's happening. The dog is barking because I did something, right? My parents are fighting with each other because I did something wrong. So personalization is another cognitive distortion. Now, as I'm saying this, I realize that a lot of us are guilty of all of these, or at some point or the other. But it becomes a cognitive distortion when we use a few of these exclusively as a means of dealing with our day to day, and that's when it becomes a problem warranting a cognitive behavior therapy, right? So even though we have it, maybe occasionally we use it, it does not mean that's a problem. But if you're using it persistently, exclusively as the only way that we understand the world around us and interact, that's when it becomes a problem, right? Then we believe that people around us are responsible for how we think and feel. What does that mean? That I'm right now in therapy with with a 36-year-old woman, and she has intense anger outbursts to the point where she might either harm herself or harm somebody around her when she's angry. And so, the day before the session, she had an anger outburst where she threatened to jump off of her balcony. She didn't, but she did it in front of her child. And so the husband and the mother in law were concerned that, she's going to repeat this. So we had a discussion, we had a session with the husband and the wife together, of course, not with the child. We didn't involve the mother in law for very specific reasons, but the husband and the wife, we had a session together. And, we spoke about what could have led to the problem and how the problem could have been handled. We spoke about the contribution of the mother in law, about the husband, and we also spoke about the contribution of the patient herself. At the end of it, we got the husband to give a commitment saying he would not provoke the wife because he had done something to provoke the wife. And then we said, all right. So the husband said he took onus for this part of the problem. For your sake, or from your perspective, what commitment can you give so that you don't repeat this? So she said, I'm actually very happy. I can be happy provided my husband and my mother in law don't do this or don't say that, which means that she believes that her anger and her entire behavior is her in-laws and her husband, they are responsible for her anger. She does not want to take onus for her feeling or behaving. So it's like, if they are okay, I'm happy. That was her stand in the whole thing. External locus of control. And that's what in the therapy I'm focusing with her, to change that to an internal locus of control, right? Emotional reasoning. I feel today is going to be a horrible day, therefore it will be a horrible day. In depression, there is also something known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. You wake up in the morning feeling that this is going to be a horrible day, and then you do a lot of things to mess up. So your mom yells at you because you spilled the milk on the floor. Then you go to school, and then your history teacher yells at you because you've not submitted your project. And then your friend has a fight with you because yesterday you did not respond to the WhatsApp message that was sent. And all of that is happening largely because you are preoccupied with something else. But then you end up saying, see, I told you it's going to be a horrible day, and what else can go wrong? You come home, and then you realize that there is no electricity. The transformer has blown up, and so you cannot watch your favorite show. And that's like the last straw, and then they have a meltdown. So they have what is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. You think, or you wake up with a thought that today is going to be a bad day. You do a series of things, and then as a result, people react to you negatively, and then you say, see, I told you it's going to be a bad day, right? So emotional reasoning. Most often people believe that the world should be fair to them. Why should the world be fair to them, right? The world is not fair to anybody, it's not unfair to anybody, but they believe that the world is fair to everybody else and I'm the only one who is suffering. That's what fallacy of fairness means. And they have a lot of shoulds. For example, 2 days ago, I was talking to a 14-year-old boy, and he said, this is how my parents treat other children. But when I go to, my uncle's house, my uncle does not treat me that way. Who is he to talk to me like that? When my parents don't talk to his children like that, why should he talk to me like this? So they make up a lot of rules in their mind, and then they get upset and frustrated when other people don't follow those rules. Sometimes those rules are so difficult to follow that even they cannot follow it. And then they end up feeling guilty that they have not followed their own rule. So they always juggle between frustration and guilt. And, that's what the distortion of shoulds ends up doing. And then, the last one most often is, I must always be right. No matter what happens in the world, I must always be right. If I make a mistake, that's it. That's the end. And that when I go wrong, God will punish me. Right? And that whatever I'm having now is an example of God being angry with me and punishing me. Okay? So, and this point, it's a repetition that others are responsible for my happiness. So, these are some of the cognitive distortions. Like I told you, there are a lot of them that are still existing, but I've just picked out a few important ones. Of all of these cognitive distortions, catastrophization, overgeneralization, black and white thinking, shoulds, always be right, external locus of control. These are the most commonly occurring ones, and these are the ones that we generally happen to deal with when we are with our clients. There are certain specific techniques that we use in CBT to handle some or these distortions. I must also tell you that not all clients have all of these distortions. Maybe they have one or two. Sorry, maybe they have one or two of these cognitive distortions which they use exclusively, and then a few others come up in situations, or they have a few of these that they keep using repeatedly. The most common thing, which is common for behavior therapy as well, and those of you who have had ABA for your child would understand, maintaining a journal. And in CBT, it is known as maintaining a thought diary. They ask you to, depending on the form of therapy, either you have the ABC of behavior or the ABCD of behavior or whatever it is. They help you to record your thoughts and feelings, and it's done with a specific purpose. I will explain to you how this is done, as in we did in the case of, AD. Then the core of the therapy focuses on identifying cognitive distortions and changing them. And that's the most important work, but the most difficult as well, because these thoughts are so well entrenched that the client even fails to identify what is the thinking process. There is a trigger and then there is a reaction. There is no gap in between for them to even think, oh my God, this is my thought that is underlying. Okay. Sometimes the clients are very tense and we have to teach them progressive muscular relaxation, which is a specific thing. So the maintaining the journal, progressive muscular relaxation, and breathing techniques are done in the beginning of the therapy. Once that's done, we have some other methods or techniques that we use in the therapy. Exposure and response prevention. If, for example, for phobias, this is something that can be done. I'm afraid of dogs, then I can be exposed to the dogs either gradually or be confronted with a friendly dog, and then allow me to experience the range of emotions, but without escaping or running away from it. And that, of course, it has to be facilitated in a very scientific manner and carefully done in order to not harm the client. The idea is not to harm the client, but to help them understand that sometimes fear is illogical. I'm not saying fear of a dog is illogical, because sometimes dogs can attack and bite, but then for you to be able to get on with life even though there is a dog, and not avoid. So we focus on how safe can it be, how far should it be from a dog, does a dog always bite or only bite at specific times, right? So that's how we go about it. Play the script till the end. Sorry, play the script till the end is a thing that we do with depression. Like, for example, I said, my pencil tip broke off, and then, my exam is going to be really bad. So when we ask them to think about, all right, so what happens when your exam goes bad? I might fail. Okay, so what happens if you fail? Then my father is going to be very angry with me. So what happens if your father is angry with you? And so we ask them to play the script right through till the end, until they reach a point they're like, oh, is that all that's going to happen? All right, then. I'm not saying it's okay to fail an exam, but I'm saying that you don't have to kill yourself over an exam. So that's what we allow them to experience. Most often, the fear or the anxiety tends to perpetuate because we're so worried about the outcome that we don't even really think of what the outcome is really going to be, but we imagine it to be the worst, and that's when catastrophization comes into play. And therefore, we learn to be anxious or upset about certain situations and events. So, within reasonable limits, we allow them to play the script till the very end, and then ask them to see that it may not be so bad after all. That's how we tackle maybe catastrophization, right? Now, let's see how to use some of these in the cases. Most often, what happens in real life is you have about 3 or 4 stages in therapy. The first stage is divided into collecting history. It could be an interview of the parents, it could be an interview of the child, depending on who the client is. If it's an adult, you take it directly from the adult itself. And then you have to formulate a hypothesis. So you formulate on the basis of, what is the issue? What is perpetuating this problem? What are the cognitive distortions? And then look at what is the basis of all of these distortions. From there, then you would get into a therapeutic relationship with the client. Supposing it's a child, you have to allow the child to be comfortable with you. So maybe 1, 2, or you sometimes even 3 sessions we may have to use the child acclimatized with the situation, and all of that is part of stage 1. By the end of stage 1, the child and the therapist and the client have become familiar with each other, they're comfortable with each other. The therapist has a very good idea in terms of what are the issues that are maintaining the problem in this individual, what are the distortions that are present, and has a very good idea in terms of what techniques he or she wants to use with the client. That is stage 1. From there, we go into stage 2. Stage 2 usually is a very varied phase. In short psychotherapies, it can be very brief. It can last for maybe 2 weeks. In the more long drawn, like for a 6-month therapy, this can last for about 4 to 5 months, right? So stage 1 usually is about maximum a month long. Then stage 2 can vary anywhere between 2 to 3. And remember, we're doing 1 session a week. So if I say month long, I'm saying about 3 or 4 sessions, depending on like say, for example, with us, if I do a therapy on a Saturday, monthly off is a second Saturday. And so we would get only 3 Saturdays in a month. So I'm looking at the first 3 or 4 sessions for stage 1. And then spanning for the next 8 to 12 sessions, maybe stage 2, where we may work with the child. I'm saying child because I know a lot of you are parents and you're looking at it from a child, but it could well be an adult. If it's a child, then the parents are also involved in stage 2. If it's another client, like I told you about this lady who I am in therapy with, then her spouse may be kept in. or people, her child may be kept in as the other person in the therapy, but the therapy is done only for the primary client. The others are kept in to support whatever is happening. So in stage 2 is where we actually indulge in using some of these techniques. Maybe we start off by the journal, and then teaching them how to relax and all of that, and then we go into the cognitive distortions. As the therapy progresses, we go into a lot of techniques that I have mentioned over here. The parents play a supportive role. They can report to us and say, well, I think that this is getting better and that is not, so we can then adapt some of the techniques around that. Then stage 3 is when we are in consensus that the child or the client is making good progress. So we first start off by reducing the frequency of the session. So instead of meeting every week, I'm going to meet you every alternate week. Then let's see what happens. If the child is still maintaining well, that the symptoms have not come back, then we push it to once in 3 weeks, and then in the meantime we give them a lot of homework that they have to do, and then monitor that with the rider, with the parents, of course, that should the problems resurface, or you feel the child is slipping back into the previous issues, you bring the child back. And then we also look at what can be the support system for the child. Who can we involve in to monitor and encourage and give positive reinforcement for the child? Could be the parents, it could be siblings, it could be the school, it could be anybody. And then once we set that up, then we go into this. So all of this is done in stage 3. Then we go into stage 4, which is termination, with a plan to monitor the progress. So termination would mean that we have the last session, we say our goodbyes, we tell the child what to look for, we reinforce certain patterns, we then ensure that there is a way in which they can reach out to us should they need our help, and that then allows them the support that we are around, but also gives them the confidence that they're ready to move on, right? So let's come back to this child AD and what I did with him. So you already know about this. I've explained all of his symptoms. If you look at his symptoms, these were some of the cognitive distortions that he had. There was a lot of catastrophization. I lose one game, that means that's the end of it. I'm no good at badminton, and therefore my teacher is very angry with me and he keeps scolding me. He picks on me all the time and he says my exercising is not good because I lost yesterday's game. So, catastrophization. He also felt that if he did not come first in class, then his mother will not be happy with him. And therefore, he must always win. He must always do well. He must never do anything wrong, because if he did something wrong, then his mother is not going to be happy. And he did not want his mother to be unhappy. So he always wanted to be right. Black and white thinking, that either I'm right or I'm wrong. There can be nothing in between. Okay. And he also felt that life was being very unfair, that his friends were, even though he did everything right, God was still punishing him, and that his friends were being mean to him. They were nice to everybody else, but only to him they were not being nice. Right. So there was the fairness fallacy that was there. Personalization, again, everybody is only pointing flaws at me. They don't seem to be taking onus for anything that's happening in my life. Personalization. And that he was very, very concerned that God was doing all of this to him, and that's why the vibhuti on his forehead. So these were some of the cognitive distortions, but he was not ready to look at any of these, for us to even point out that this was a cognitive distortion. So I didn't straight away go into identifying the distortion. We started with maintaining a journal. I said, why don't you write down, he said, how many times in a day you were doing the KK. We decided to call it KK because that's how he wanted to address the repetitive behavior that he was indulging in. Right. So why don't you maintain a journal? So he said, no, I can't do that. Why? Because I keep doing it all the time. Right. So then I said, okay, can I ask your mother to keep a frequency chart in terms of when you're doing it? And he said, no, then she'll get very upset with me. So then I said, okay, Maybe you can write, let's start with one time in the day that you used it, what happened, how did you do it, for how many times did you do it, how did you feel at the end of it. So just one event in a day. So with that he was willing to write. Till then he was not willing to maintain a journal, and he insisted that his parents don't see it at all, and that he didn't want me also to see it. And only after I assured him that he can read out whatever he wants from the journal, he agreed to write the journal. So he did write it, but invariably he would insist that he bring it to the session but not show it to me. And then we got him to read out maybe one or two of those, situations. From there, then I taught him some breathing exercise, relaxation, and then he won a couple of games in badminton. Of course, he lost a couple of games. Using that, then we went to cognitive restructuring to help him find out, okay, you won two games and you lost one game. So, how come God decides to help you when you win, and God decides to punish you when you lose? So he said, but God didn't help me win. I won because I played well. So then I said, why is God then only responsible for losses? And so then we started questioning his thoughts. And then he started realizing that, oh, maybe there is something to this that's happening. Then we went into, the script, playing the script. And he realized that if I'm looking at God to protect me, and if I'm praying to God, so I used the fact that he was a religious child in the session. Why will God punish me? God is a protector. So therefore, is he a punisher also? See, we got him to look at some of these, and then finally he reached a stage where if he dropped a piece of paper on his leg, he would not do the repetitive act for at least 5 minutes. So that was exposure and response prevention for him. It had reached a stage where even if his friends dropped a piece of paper at their table, he would start doing the act repetitively at his desk, even though he was like 3 rows away from that child. Right? So we got him slowly to be exposed to pieces of paper or books or whatever fallen down, and him not doing the repetitive act, which he called as KK. Right? At the end of this, so this went on, and I'm saying all of this like as if it happened in a few minutes, but it actually spanned over 2 months, like I told you. And at the end of 2 months, we were able to bring that, the behavior didn't disappear, but bring it down to maybe 3 times in a day. And he was able to allow pieces of paper or pencils or erasers to be fallen on the floor and did not have an urge to pick it up or put it away and then apologize for that behavior, right? So we were able to bring him to that. With that, he realized that he was less anxious. He was not demanding reassurance from his mother. He was not dependent on his mother as much as he was. He continued to be dependent on her. In the meantime, we also allowed the mother to see her role in this, that every time she was either reassuring him, reassuring, until she reached a point where it was irritating her and she would snap at him. When she snapped, he became upset. My mother also does not love me, therefore, God is punishing me. And then he would go into his distortion. So, we helped the mother see how she was helping maintaining his behavior and asked her to withdraw the reassurance that she was giving him. So, but then, her worry was he would look at it as, oh, my mother's not talking to me. So, that was a black and white thinking on the mother's part. So, we helped her to see that she was not actually going to say give up on him, but instead talk to him and say, when you ask me this, maybe 2 times in the day I will reassure you, and thereafter I will just look at you and you have to tell me what you think at that point. Do you think that you're a good child or you've been a bad child? And then we will go on as life as usual. So having spoken to the child about this, he knew that this was what the mother would do, and this was set up in front of me so that he knew it was not a punishment and that his mother was not rejecting him. And then he was able to overcome all of this. So that's how we set it up. And we got the father, of course, was not playing a major role in maintaining. Of course, he was also busy. He had very long working hours. Except for the weekend, he had very little interaction with the child. The child enjoyed playing with the father, going out with him, and we allowed that to happen without any interference. But it was the mother that he was targeting the most because he was spending maximum time with her, and we involved her in the restructuring. Just one more last case before I wind up and end the talk. 15-year-old girl, I'm continuing to see her, but this girl I thought was a very, very important case that I needed to share with you. I first saw her when she was 4 years old. She came in with very, very high levels of anxiety. She also had motor coordination issues. And so the assessment at that point that we did with her placed her in the at risk category for learning disorder. So the parents were informed about it. We also said that we will monitor the anxiety. We are not sure at this point whether it's secondary to her learning needs or is an independent problem. Only, as things move forward, we would be able to tell. She was enrolled with us for a while, for a very brief period, I think about 2 months, in our intervention program for the at-risk category. After which, her motor coordination issues started getting better. So, for various reasons, the parents pulled her out of therapy. We had not completed the process, but they pulled her out of the remedial program. Then 4 years later, she came back because there was significant amount of bullying in the school, and she had developed anxiety secondary to that. Her learning needs by then now from I think LKG to now she had gone to third standard. Third standard, we also know that there was a lot of writing and CBSE system. The child was not able to cope with. Writing and math were her two areas that she had severe problems with. Reading was okay, spelling was okay, but writing and math was a problem. So we have again very brief session. I don't think more than 2 sessions I've had with the child at this point to handle her anxiety. But we realized a lot of anxiety was coming because of the bullying. So then she was referred to change the school. The parents did that. She did exceptionally well in the new school. So again, she dropped out of therapy. Then 4 years later, she came back. By now, she was in between grades 7 and 8. She had developed depression and there was anxiety. And her academic performance was relatively, not very bad, but it was in a stage where she couldn't handle math. Her writing, with some pressure from her mother, she was able to write, but math she couldn't handle. So at this point in time, I insisted that if they continue or they want my support, she has to be with me for remedial training for at least 3 months. So we did the remedial training for her and then isolated her problem to only math. So exemption was sought for math. And then thereafter, remember, she was between grade 7 and 8. So from grade 8, she's just finished the recent bout of SSLC exams in the midst of this corona. And a lot of unfortunate events have happened, but I'll talk to you about that. Between grades 8 and 10, we've been doing cognitive behavior therapy with her to help her handle her anxiety and depression. So why did she come at that time and why did she stick? She came at this point in time because by now she had reached a stage where she, of course, had started her menstrual cycles. Her physique development was such that she was overweight. Because she was overweight, she was worried that people will start teasing her, and she couldn't go out. If she went out, she believed that there would be people stalking her, they might kidnap her, and that was causing a lot of anxiety, and she would end up having panic attacks. So a lot of negative thoughts. There were difficulty breathing because she was scared to go out. She did not share this with her mother was forcing her to go for tuitions or her dance class or whatever, and she had to just 2 blocks away. So the mother said, "You can easily walk." But this child couldn't walk because she thought there would be a stalker or somebody might kidnap her. Mother was not aware of that. And that led to a lot of anger outbursts. And that then led to her locking herself up in her room, not wanting to meet anybody. And that was the state that she was in when we started therapy. So obviously, all through we've been talking about her negative thoughts, her cognitive distortions, focusing on, being realistic. One of the things is, I'm no good because I can't do math. So, which is true. She can't do math. She's no good in math. All right. But does that mean she's no good? So, the overgeneralization. So, a lot of times in the therapy, we would have to focus on that. Or then she would come up and say, unfortunately, there was a robbery in the house. Somebody broke in. So, she was like, what if they break in and they take me away? That was a worry. So it's a genuine worry. It can happen, right? So then we had to look at being realistic, but at the same time looking at what are the various ways that she can deal with it. And finally, she reached a stage where at the start of this academic year, she said, "I'm miserable. I cannot do anything." And then it turned out that she was made the school captain. She was made the school captain. She got a 20 on 20 in one of her math tests, and she surprised us and she surprised everybody else. But despite that, she felt she was no good, right? So we got her to look at, is this black and white thinking, is this overgeneralization, is this catastrophization, what is it? And then based on that, the CBT progressed. She finally finished her exams, and let me tell you that just before she started her exams, she lost her grandfather to COVID, because of which her mother and mother's brother and grandmother, all three were kept in isolation because they were not sure whether they were going to be tested positive. So she had to manage the home with her father and take the SSLC exam all on her own. And at the end of it, she never once got in touch with me through the process of all of this. After she finished her exam, she called me up to tell me, "I finished my exam, but all of this happened. I'm not sure how I'm going to do, but I don't care. I've finally finished school." So, I'm still continuing to be in therapy with her. It's an on and off process, but she has reached a stage where she is realistic about her fears. Some are rooted in reality, some are not, but she knows which are distortions. And once the distortion comes, she tries to handle it on her own. When it reaches a stage that she cannot handle it anymore, that's when she reaches for help. So, even though there are challenges with the children, the CBT can be rooted in really, realistic issues. That brings us to, how do we view CBT? There are lots of other therapies that one can give, but how do we view specifically CBT? It's quick, it's time limited, very, very engaging. It helps the client be responsible for the outcome, and not it's not the therapist's job but the client's job. It helps the client to develop skills in identifying their own distortions, focus on stress and coping strategies, and it has very good long-term outcomes. So many of these people may also have psychiatric treatment. They may be on medication. What research has shown is, despite the fact, so medicine alone may not be useful, therapy may or may not be useful on its own. Sometimes a combination is best. And when an individual is in a combination of both medication from a psychiatrist and therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, the outcomes are phenomenally good, in such a way that we can either prevent relapses or abort relapses in a very, very short span of time. So in a short span of time, we can bring about a lot of changes. Usually, CBT is advised for adults, but modifications are made for children. One of the things that used to be required earlier was that it has to be average intelligence at least, because you have to be able to identify what are your cognitive distortions, and there must be very, very high levels of motivation. But in my experience, even if motivation is not very high, and if the intelligence is also not very high, it still is possible for us to use a modified version of cognitive behavior therapy, and we are able to make the child aware of the thoughts, and be able to change it over a period of time, right? So despite these shortcomings, a lot of changes and dramatic results can be produced in a very, very short span of time. But the only thing that we need to remember is that this requires a trained therapist to carry out the intervention, right? So I'd sort of stop my talk here and we'll throw it open for questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Here's our first question. My child is SLD, who is very lovely, care, and empathetic. But you
Mhm.
say anything not do or it can be done afterward. Child
Mm.
get very violent and shout to the core as well. He will
Okay.
irritate us not to tell anything further.
Mm.
What to do? Please help me.
Okay. So the irritability and the yelling are a result of the frustration that the child is experiencing. It could be with learning disability, it could be with any other problems. But the rule of thumb is no communication to be held with a child when the child is yelling and shouting. Once the child has reached that stage of a negative emotional state, no amount of reasoning will help. So the most important thing for us to do is to wait till the child is calm and relaxed, and then talk to the child about what happened. Why were you angry? What is it that triggered this? And then let's see if we can arrive at a maybe a contract with the child.
Thank you, ma'am. This is related to going through the worst case scenario script. Like, what do you think will happen if you fail? How can we help if the child answers with, I don't know? And that the uncertainty is what the causes of anxiety.
Right. Very true. Very true. Like I said in one of my slides, children are they don't have the sophistication of language that adults have. So most likely they are going to say I don't know, which is some of the modifications that we do with the CBT process. So once or twice we may supply some of the words. So if you fail, are you worried that your father is going to punish you? Are you worried that your friends will laugh at you? So we can ask prompting questions, but not too many, just a few, so that they start thinking on those lines. Depending on the age of the child, if it's a very young child, may not be ready to talk about it, but at least they will understand what you're saying, and then you can take it forward from there. These are realistic worries. So we can say, yes, maybe you would fail, but does that mean that's the end of the world? Can you do something? Can you take the exam again? Can we look at doing another exam? What is it that you want to do, and can we achieve it without passing exams? So there are so many options that we can consider.
Thank you so much, ma'am. How to help the child to overcome the fear of darkness and huge sounds, and also fear of small insects.
Okay, there are three different things. Huge sounds. Sometimes there are people who are very sensitive to noise, right? And most often, children who are on the spectrum or children with autism are noticed to be very, very sensitive to noise. The second point, so that is something we have to keep in mind. The second point is that very young children are afraid of a lot of things. Darkness is one of them. So it is natural in the process of development for them to be afraid of darkness. And the third thing is in terms of insects. It is a realistic fear because some of them can be poisonous, some of them can sting you. It can be a fairly fatal, like wasps and bees, for example, can be fatal. Some spiders can be very poisonous. So it is, these are genuine fears. Regardless of that, we can estimate the extent to which there is fear for all of this, the extent to which the individual is avoiding. So what we focus on is the avoidance behavior that the individual is exhibiting in these times. So if let's look at darkness, because the child is afraid of dark, or is the child not wanting to go to the washroom at night, because of which the bedwetting is happening? Because the child is afraid of the dark, is he always keeping the light on in his room and not having sleep? Because the child is afraid of dark, child is always sleeping with me. So we can estimate the level of avoidance behavior. All three will result in avoidance behavior. And the best way to tackle all of these is graded exposure and response prevention. Response prevention would be the avoidance. So, in smaller doses, expose the child to the situations in such a way. For example, let's look at insects. I'm afraid of insects, and so I'm like, I know a child who is terrified of lizards. He did not want to go on a school trip because he was afraid that there would be lizards in the bathroom wherever they're staying. So then we had a discussion about, if there's a lizard on the table you're sitting at, will you be afraid? If there's a lizard on the wall, will you be afraid? If there's a lizard on the door, will you be afraid? So we got him to make a list of all of those and then rank them in the order of the fear that he has. This is least fearful, that's most fearful, and then rank them. Once he did that, then we explored which are going to be possible, which are not going to be possible for him to experience on the trip. Of the ones that were possible, we looked at starting from the least threatening situation for him, and then we started exposing him. Remember, I can't really bring a lizard into the room. So in his mind, he exposed himself to it, and then gradually he realized that his fear will peak and then come down, and that's how we helped him. And finally, he actually then he's we made some realistic suggestions. If there's a lizard on the wall, what can you do? Turn on the light, open the door slowly, wait till the lizard goes and hides in a corner, because the lizard is as afraid of you as you are of the lizard. Then you go finish your job, close the door, switch off the light, and then you won't have any direct contact with the lizard. That kind of a realistic limit setting, exposure, and response prevention usually helps. And that's what we also as therapists would do.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And another question is, the child is 13 years aged. They
Mhm.
have moved to Bangalore 2 years back,
Mm,
and they have changed the school also. But child is not happy there,
mm,
and he doesn't. He's always says that I'm not good and nobody wants to be my friend.
mm,
And he always complains that I don't have anyone to play. Others bully me and make fun of him.
mm,
So he reacts at times and also gets physical with others. This is the
mm.
worry of one of the parent.
Right. So one is it true that the child does not have friends? Quite likely that might be true, because but at the age of 13 they already would have formed groups, and it would be difficult for this child to adjust and fit in with the friends here. So can the parents then approach the school and figure out if the school from their side can facilitate some kind of a social interaction? Two is probably to also seek professional help for the child, so that the child can be helped with how the child can cope, because this is a genuine issue where the child would need some professional help to be able to, in a graded manner, attempt to make friends rather than be physically aggressive.
Okay, ma'am. So another question. My son is 6.5 years and he's very fond of Indian flag.
Mm,
Wherever he sees, he keeps on asking for it, and he doesn't concentrate on anything if he gets it. Could you
mm.
just guide me on how to overcome this behavior? He has been undergoing OT for past 2.5 years.
Right. So this looks like the child is fascinated with the flag for very specific reasons. Maybe the child has other more issues than one. If the child is already in OT, looks like usually this kind of a preoccupation we see with children with either autism or children who are on the spectrum. Uh, they usually hold on to some object or the other, which gives them a sense of security, and that also keeps them so absorbed that they are that is the stimulation for them. They seek stimulation and they go into a shell, into their own world, and this is how it prevents them from exploring the world outside. So there's a lot of anxiety in children who are on the spectrum in trying to interact with people outside in the world. If you stop the child and not give him the flag, he's going to be restless and he's going to be aggressive. On the other hand, if you give the flag and yield to the child's demands, then he is not going to concentrate on anything else. So, usually, the thing that we do is, if by chance the child happens to see a flag, don't stop him from it, let him have it. However, in order to distract him from the obsession with the flag or whatever the object is, structure his day in such a way that he is doing things which are interesting for him, and let him move from one to another. As his cognitive abilities improve, as his interests widen, this obsession that he has with the flag will go away. The stronger you say, I'm not going to yield to your demand for the flag, the stronger the need to hold on to the flag will become. So you've got to wean it off very carefully rather than have a strict, inflexible no at this point.
Thanks again, ma'am. Another question. My daughter is obsessed with Barbies. Whenever we go to market, she will find anything printed with Barbies from her smallest corners. Her eyes
Hmm.
always look for Barbie printed products. What
Hmm.
can I do to avoid it? She wants to buy them always. Her age is 8 years, ma'am.
Okay. Well, I understand this Barbie obsession with girls. Having brought up a girl myself, I know exactly how it feels. For boys, it's, I think, Hot Wheel cars, and for girls, it is the Barbies. Having said that, it's not a major problem, not something that you need to worry about, but we can contract with the child that if you want to have a Barbie collection, there's absolutely nothing wrong, and you can set that as a reinforcement and allow the child to earn that Barbie, right? So she can make a list of things that she wants to buy, and you can decide what are the things that she has to do to earn that. That way, you learn to encourage the child to hold on to the impulse to buy something immediately, and at the same time you are making it dependent on certain behavior that you want to shape. Of course, please don't use food or academic performance as targets. It can be simple other things. Maybe you do your household chores for a whole month without us reminding you, and you earn so many points, and after so many points you will be able to buy this much of a Barbie product. So when you set limits like that, what you're really doing is delaying that need to want to buy a Barbie. So when you delay that, when the child has had enough time to think over it, then usually the child does not want it after a point. By the time she's 10, she's going to be tired of Barbie and she's going to give it up anyway, eventually, right? So you can make it contingent, and you can also help her to control her impulses. That's the most important thing here.
Okay, ma'am. Thanks for that. 10-year child needs mom to study how to make the child self dependent.
Okay. Needing mom to study, especially if it is a special needs child, is a realistic need. However, you can break up the whole study into smaller bits and encourage the child to master certain bits independently. What do I mean by that? Supposing the child needs your help for reading but does not need your help for writing, right? Then you can be there when the child is reading, prompt the child to read, have a discussion about what you have read and how much you have understood, read the question for the child, and then say, now I'm not going to help you with the writing of the answer, you write the answer. So you start off with something that the child can do independently, reinforce that, make it a very positive experience, then gradually go up to the point where the child is not able to do things and needs your help, right? Just yesterday, I was having a discussion with this boy who's preparing for his NIOS exam, and the mother said that he doesn't sit with me at all, or he doesn't allow me to go out of the room. He's constantly wanting me to check his work. And so when I asked the child, "Is that true?" He said, "I can do the letter writing, I can do comprehension, but I don't know how to write a note, or I don't know how to write a telephone conversation," which is part of the NIOS English paper, right? So we brought it down to a point where, and the mother agreed, yeah, other things she's doing, it's only this. So then we entered into a contract with the mother and son saying he can do letter writing on his own, but when he is doing telephonic conversation, you sit with him. Mother said, "I've done that, but he still doesn't want to write." Then the child said, "That's because I find it difficult to write a telephonic conversation." So then we broke it down, and I asked him, "What is difficult?" He said, "It's difficult for me to write 100 words." Then immediately mother started shouting, said 100 words is not required, blah, blah, blah. So we calmed both of them down. And then I said, start by writing 3 sentences. If it is wrong, mother will tell you what is wrong. You try and correct it. Then for a whole week, you write 3 sentences. Next week, it will become 4. The week after that, it will become 5. Then it becomes 7. And then if you want, 10. So now he has agreed. So make it smaller, more manageable units for the child, and then gradually increase that.
Thanks again, ma'am. Ma'am, that is a very interesting question here. What comes first? Is it a thought or a belief?
Ah, good question. It's a thought. A series of thoughts then lead to what we call as creating a schema. Once the schema is stuck, every thought that comes, the schema is either accepted or rejected. For example, "I'm not a good person" is a schema, right? It starts off with my mother saying, "You're a stupid girl, you spilled water on the floor." My mother said that, and then I'm upset, and then I believe that I'm not good. That then forms the schema that I'm a useless person and nobody loves me. Every time my mother scolds me, that schema gets strengthened. Every time my father beats me, that schema gets strengthened. Every time my teacher punishes me, that schema gets strengthened. So the starting point is a thought, which then leads to the schema, and the schema becomes permanent, and that leads you to interpret the world on the basis of that schema, which is wrong.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, there is another question, very interesting, I felt. Can CBT help in past failures and disappointments?
Yes, I saw that comment too. Of course, it can, very much so. Because on the basis of past failures is where and how we evaluate ourselves and how we place ourselves now. And that is what determines what we think and feel about ourselves. For sure, you can challenge all of that and you can change it to a point where you can become successful. It can definitely be done.
Okay, ma'am. What are the areas in which CBT is used? Can it be applied to general psychological issues as well as disorders?
Yes, it can be. Like I said, anger management, having negative thoughts about the self, feeling a sense of disillusionment, depression, anxiety, post traumatic stress disorder, sleep disorders, chronic pain. It has a wide range, not necessarily mental health disorders. Even a person who just feels, "I've reached a stage where I'm fed up and I don't know what else to do with myself." Like I remember I was doing CBT with a boy, and for over a while, and then the father said, "Would you help me also? I've reached a stage where I want a career change, but I don't know what." There was no mental health problem there, but he was just in a phase where he was stuck in terms of making a decision. And we just had one session, and he was able to resolve his conflict. So, even for simple conflicts, CBT can be quite effectively used.
Okay. There is another different question. If my daughter is angry with me, she
Mhm.
shows it to her tuition teacher too
Mm.
by not cooperating with her.
Mhm.
In brief, she hates me. She hates to be corrected or be told she
Mm.
is wrong. So,
Mm.
can you guide me in this?
Sure. That's a very, very common issue that children have. and particularly children with learning disability or ADHD, and they believe the person who helps them do their academics is the worst because they are the one who are constantly correcting them. So we can, when they are angry, it's difficult, like I told you, to correct them, but you can talk to them about what is it that upset them after the, like, say, she's been corrected, she's angry, and she screams a lot and all of that. After the drama is over, when the child is calm, maybe you can have a discussion with the child to say that, yes, these are the things that I have said. What do you feel upset about? Maybe the child says, I understand that I'm not correct, but can you not use this word and say it this way? They really pick on a few. It's not, sometimes it's not what you're saying, but how you're saying that matters to the child. So you can look at having a respectful conversation with the child to figure out what about that conversation is unhelpful. From there, then you can build up and say, maybe there are things that say, if I don't correct you, then you will not learn it the right way. Therefore, it's important. So if you don't want me to tell you, what else can I do? Can I use a red pen to make a correction? Or can I make a list and stick it next to your table? So there can be ways in which you can do it, which will not upset the child. So you can enter into a discussion with the child, take the child's suggestions, see what will suit both of you, and then work on it.
Okay. Ma'am, there is one question like they just want to know. They are eager to
Mhm.
know that if the child,
Mm.
child whom you addressed AD, was
Mm.
he able to come out or at least reduce his KKBR after your therapy?
Absolutely. Like I said, from 40 times a day, it came to maybe 3 times in a day. And the mother said, I have not seen him. The 3 times also is reported by the child. So we don't know if it's true. So for sure, we know that it has reduced. And everybody in the clinic, so he would come every Saturday to see me at a particular time. And we started getting feedback from the other parents around who were around for various other sessions to say, oh, he looks so much more cheerful now and he looks less anxious now. So it was a very, very visible and dramatic change in a very short span of time.
Okay. The child is 6 years old, ma'am, and
Mhm.
she is very anxious child.
Mhm.
Does bedwetting at time and have toilet accidents. She
Mm.
had 4 incidents of febrile seizures. She
Mm.
bites her nails when she watches TV or in toilet or
Mm.
when she is anxious. How
Mm.
to stop her from nail biting? And sometimes she gets angry or cause harm to me when I say no to her
Mm.
request.
Okay. This sounds like a child who's very, very high on anxiety and probably would benefit from professional help. Soiling herself and bedwetting are clear indications of some kind of an emotional issue with the child. These are simple and easy fixes. They can be fixed by a professional, like I said, in a very short span of time. So maybe seeking professional help would definitely benefit.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, are you ready to take few more questions, ma'am?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Yeah. There is one child who becomes aggressive when he
Mm.
had asked to write.
Mm.
He is good in oral and a special child.
Mm.
Uh, is the behavior is okay to accept? They have not mentioned what is the
What is
difficulty
the
with the child. Yeah, they have
Mm.
just told a special child. We
Right?
are not sure with what the difficulty they have.
Okay. Most likely, if the child is getting aggressive, especially when writing, I'm looking at a child with a writing disorder. Um, and writing is something that does not immediately respond to inputs. All special educators who work with children know that. It is possible to overcome this by talking to the child, like I said with this other child that I spoke about, and zooming in on what is the exact problem that the child is facing. Is it that I don't like to write at all, or is it that I don't like to write long answers, or is it that my hand hurts when I write for a long time, or that I don't like the feedback I get when I write? What aspect of writing is not pleasurable for the child, and then see how you can build it in. It is possible to work on it. Maybe when we do a section on cognitive interventions, that can be addressed. It is possible.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. And there is one interesting question here, ma'am, to the right,
Mhm.
the present situation. A
Mhm.
parent is asking how to motivate a child to
Mm.
stick to class course at home. Now that
Mm.
the classes are happening through recorded sessions, the
Mhm.
child does not have motivation because it is not group learning and no interaction like in the school.
Right. We can look at having some kind of a reinforcement pattern. And just like how, household chores are not motivating for the child, but if we associate it with something positive, then we can look at, encouraging the child to attend. So, for example, if you attend 80% of the classes for this whole week, then at the end of the week, maybe I can't say we'll go out, but I can say maybe I can, cook your favorite dish, or you get so many points and you get to show off. I'll make a badge for you and you can show that off. And if you get 5 badges, you can exchange it for something. So, convert it to something that is positive for the child. It's not a bribe, it's not a threat, but and you're not saying 100% attendance, you're saying 80% attendance, right? Which then gives the child, a reason to want to attend this, and then starts talking about, this class I don't like, that class I want to attend. And then eventually everything becomes interesting, because it's associated with a positive feeling.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, there is a question. Can
Mhm.
CBT be effective with grief management?
It can be, yes.
Okay. Would you recommend medication for a child beyond therapy?
Sometimes it might be required, but if the therapy is effective, most often, while the individual is in therapy itself, medication is tapered down and removed. So, very effective therapies, usually the child may not need, but it depends on the problem. There is no harm in keeping the child on medication post therapy, also.
Okay, ma'am. There is one parent, last question, ma'am.
Mhm.
There is one parent, he's telling like he could identify few of the cognitive distortions you mentioned with his daughter, with his or
Mhm.
her daughter.
Hmm.
So thanks for that. And they says that the daughter is LD, but she's
Hmm.
very interested in joining the Indian Air Force.
Hmm.
While I don't want to discourage her and be supportive, her learning challenges do hold her back from perhaps achieving many ambitious goals she has. How can I
True.
help her in this, and more importantly, to stay positive?
Setting realistic goals probably are the easiest to achieve, but also the most difficult, because it takes a toll on us. However, just because the child is having LD, it does not mean everything in the armed forces is completely ruled out. There can be certain things that are open, but that would require a lot of research work. So it may not be directly involved, but there can be a direct and indirect way in which the child can contribute to the armed forces. So we can look at exploring, and also look at why the child wants to join the armed forces. Can there be other careers which are similar to that the child can explore, which are possible despite the fact that there is a learning disability? If the child is very young, I may not want to go into this discussion right away. If the child is in, say 13, 14, 15, then the father and the child, or the mother and the child, can do their research together to see what are the criteria for admission, and then look at what else they can explore for if armed forces is completely ruled out.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, one last question.
No
They have
problem.
requested it actually. What kind of rewards can be used to motivate children?
Rewards could be stars. Initially it can be points, and that then can be exchanged for, it could be something that, like, I know a parent who used these rewards and points to get them a pet. It could be a cycle that they've been asking for a very long time. It could be a Legos, because Legos, I'm told, are very expensive. So it depends on what it is that the child has been asking for, and you want the child to earn it. It's like if I want to buy a mobile phone, and I know it, like an iPhone is very expensive. I'm not going to be able to walk into a store and buy it, but I set aside some money for it every month, and then I finally buy it. At that time, I might decide whether I want it or not. So you can have any such thing as a reward. It does not have to be anything expensive. Many a times, the reward that parents have indulged in is like, Saturday evening between 7 and 8, I spend time with only this child, no other distraction. So just this child and me. Maybe we go for a walk, maybe we have a jamming session of music, or we play tennis. It could be even just a story reading session. It does not have to be gifts that are given to the child. What you decide should be in consultation with your child, and what the family approves of and has the means to get. It can be really anything.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. You had answered all of our questions.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
so much, ma'am.
My pleasure. Thank you very
Uh,
much.
okay, ma'am. Can we? Yeah. Nothing, ma'am. I'll get back to you.
Sure, sure. So I can disconnect now, right?
Ma'am, please be online. One second.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, everybody can leave. Hello. No, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. No, no, no. It's not. Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. That's what I thought. Yes, ma'am. You can please come. 2 minutes, huh? Viji ma'am will just join in. She was there actually. She just left it. You can. You are on mute, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Okay, is that better now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay.
She's here, ma'am.
Hello, madam.
She. Viji
Not
ma'am.
better?
Yeah, yeah. She's here. She's
Okay.
here. Viji ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am, thank you so much for your
Hello.
session. It was so
My
useful,
pleasure.
and parents were really happy to have the information from you. We want to know, like as you mentioned, the cognitive intervention session. Will
Mm-hmm.
it be more about like addressing the children by the parents? Will it be of in that line?
You mean giving them specific techniques on how to improve certain things? Yeah, sure, sure. Yes,
Okay,
it
okay, that
can
will
be.
be more help to the parents, we believe. So we'll
That,
reach out to you,
yes.
ma'am, again with your timing. We'll check and see.
Sure,
Ma'am,
yeah.
if we come up with any more queries, is it possible for you to address? Maybe we'll call out and share it with you.
Sure, sure. You can do that. No problem.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
ma'am. It was very,
This
very
is-
good.
yeah. Thank
Ma'am,
you for the opportunity.
can we share her mail ID?
Is it okay, ma'am, if you share your contact to them?
Please do.
Email ID
Please
to them?
share my mail ID. There's no problem at all. They can get in
Okay.
touch with me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you
for
so
your
much,
time.
ma'am. It was
Thank
very
you.
nice. Thank
Yeah.
you, ma'am.
My
Yeah.
pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hello, Vijay ma'am.